It was a cold morning on December 12, 2016, when the gates of a state prison in Pennsylvania slowly opened. From there, a 53-year-old woman emerged. She walked through unhurriedly, without handcuffs, without looking back, literally. The winter wind hit her face, but she showed nothing. No relief, no regret. She just walked to the parking lot. 20 whole years. She had served her full sentence. She was free now. No one was waiting for her with flowers. No one welcomed her with open arms. But somewhere in Wilkes-Barre, a family still carried the weight of that day. Because her freedom didn't erase what had happened 25 years earlier. It didn't erase the suffering of a man who died. He died slowly, without even understanding why. I'm Marcos Campos, and today I'm going to tell you about the case of Robert Curley. Bob, guys, one of those cases that will make you say, wow, it feels like I went back in time. But before we start, leave your like, your comment, even if it's just an emoji, it helps me a lot. Consider becoming a member here on the channel and check your subscription so you don't miss any episodes. It's every week. There's one on Monday, another on Wednesday, and another on Friday. At least sometimes there are some extra episodes that show up. And taking this opportunity here, guys, right, now that Carnival is over and the year is really starting for real in March, I wanted to ask you if you've already made a change in your life too, guys. I'll leave a link here for you to a WhatsApp from our forensics course. Well, not ours, right? The one I'm taking is a forensics course for those of you who love investigation. Understanding how things work in practice is a course that's truly worthwhile. You have online classes and you also have the immersion, which is in person, where you'll learn a lot of things there with Professor Danilo Pele, so it's really worth it. Go check it out, no strings attached. Have a chat with the people from Empate Forense. They will answer all your questions before you decide if this is what you want. But if you like true crime and you're looking for something to do, like work in that field, even so, guys, or if you already have a profession and want to do a post-grad, right? Does it work like that too? If you already have a degree, you'll find a good path to follow there. Why am I saying this? Because, man, that's how it is. You can receive appointments. You don't need to take a civil service exam, and you get appointments from judges, from cases, from all kinds of cases. Okay. It's not just criminal forensics. There are several types of forensics, and like, you get appointed, you have jobs there where a simple report, your report, man, 5K, and it goes from there. So, like, if you dedicate yourself, it could be a door that opens for you now in 2026, all right? Is the link here? Message about the data delivered. Let's get to the facts, Robert, or Bob Curley, was that guy who was adored by his friends, you know? He was 32 years old. He had a solid life already built there with his own hands. He was an electrician, highly qualified, worked with a team, was the boss, and everyone wanted to be part of his team. So you can see how it is. Bob was a respected guy. He worked overtime without hesitation. He was a determined guy because above all, he really liked what he did. Of course, he needed the money to help his family, but there was that extra something he did because he really enjoyed it, you know? There, in his family, he liked to go fishing with his brother David on weekends. He laughed a lot at the jokes, pretty harsh ones I'd say, from his coworkers, and he always had a kind word for anyone who needed to hear it. And just over a year ago, he had gotten married again. His wife now brought a stepdaughter to live with them, a little girl, 4 years old, named Angela. A little girl, in fact, whom Bob treated as if she were his own daughter, with a lot of love and care. They lived in a simple duplex in a neighborhood with some workers, right? With the people who worked with him there from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. They weren't rich, but they didn't go without either. They had a good life. Bob earned enough to pay the bills, and there was some money left over, you know, to dream, let's say, right? And the dreams were getting bigger. His wife's first husband had died in a car accident. And at that moment, in this part of the story, I'm telling you, there was a lawsuit going on against the transportation company where Bob's wife's ex-husband used to work. And apparently it was a pretty generous settlement. We're talking over $1 million, huh? Bob even mentioned to some of his close friends that he might take a share of that money to start his own business in his field of electrical work. Anyway, he was dreaming, right? A chance there to have his own business to grow more. And in that summer of 1991, Bob was leading a team and they were doing a renovation in one of the buildings at Wilkes University, at the university, From the place where they lived, there were classrooms, hallways, science labs. The place was a mess when they arrived. Old furniture, equipment scattered around, bottles of chemicals forgotten there on the counters, and the team had to clean all of that up before starting the job. There, they worked about 12 hours a day so they wouldn't fall behind on the construction schedule. Bob never complained about anything. He said that the overtime pay was really worth it and that above all, he really liked the guys he worked with. He even mentioned the guys by name, Sammy De Pasquale, Robert Moroni, and also the others on the team. So guys, you can imagine what the atmosphere was like there, right? With the guys at the construction site, right? They were always messing with each other and you know, those heavy jokes. Just so you get an idea, and this detail here, later on, you'll understand why I'm mentioning it. The guys would even mess with each other chewing, you know when there are some guys who chew tobacco, right? So the guys would chew tobacco there and spit in each other's cans just to mess around, right? But it wasn't even a prank that put anyone's life at risk. It was just that kind of messing around, you know? And one day Bob started feeling sick, kind of tired. An unusual tiredness, strange pains in his legs, sweating, chills, shortness of breath. And he thought all of that was just from working too much. He would say, "Oh, it's just tiredness, it'll pass." But he kept climbing the stairs, running the wires, leading the team there with a firm hand. But no one had any idea that what Bob was feeling had nothing to do with being tired from work. Bobby Curley was always the guy who did the hard work, who held strong. When the pain started, he didn't stop working. He kept doing everything he always did. And when the people who worked with him would say, you know, they'd say, "Man, you look like you're not doing so well." He'd say, "No, it's just my body asking for a break," right? And he would tell himself that in his mind too. His co-workers, however, noticed that he was pale, kind of, sweating more than usual with that heavy, labored breathing. And then, Sammy De Pascal and Robert, his work buddies there, the same ones who used to play those dirty pranks, like spitting in the guy's can and stuff. Anyway, they started bugging Bobby, saying, "Bobby, go home, man. You're not well, dude." But Bobby insisted, "No, I'm fine and I'm going to keep going. Life goes on." But on August 23rd, 1991, it was a Friday, his body couldn't take it anymore. It said enough. As he was crossing the university parking lot, Bobby's legs felt very heavy. Every step he took there felt like someone was squeezing his nerves with pliers. Over in the lab, they were renovating and his sweat was dripping, running down his face. Heavy, And everyone on the team was watching, noticing, saying, "Man, go home. You look like a ghost." But Bobby, stubborn as he was, just kept going, until one day he left work, kind of convinced that he needed to rest, He was driving and thought, "Wow, it's finally time to get home, take a shower, and lie down after this day." Then, on Saturday morning, instead of waking up feeling more relaxed, more rested, he woke up. Even worse, the pain in his legs had become excruciating, going up his thighs, like something was burning him from the inside, right there. His hands, according to reports, were tingling, then they went numb. So he tried to get out of bed that day and almost fell. That's when he admitted to himself that it had nothing to do with work. It was some kind of illness. So, the first appointment he had was a quick one. The doctor listened to the symptoms: intense pain, numbness, extreme fatigue, and said it didn't seem like anything serious. He told him to rest, said his body was stressed. Your body is asking for a break, Bobby. So Bobby did what the doctor said, right? He spent the rest of Saturday and all of Sunday lying down, but on Sunday night, the pain was still there. It didn't let up. So, he picked up the phone and called a colleague. He said, "Hey, I won't be able to make it tomorrow, sorry." On Monday, August 26th, Bobby couldn't even stand up on his own anymore. His wife tried to help him to the bathroom to do basic things, but she just couldn't manage. So she ended up calling Bobby's brother David, who lived nearby and all. David arrived and carried Bobby in his arms, as if he really was a completely debilitated person. And by that point, everyone already understood that it wasn't going to get better just by lying down and resting. The family called an ambulance and went to the hospital. At the hospital, the pain exploded. His legs were on fire. He started vomiting and he began screaming in the hallways from the pain. And there he went through a series of tests until a doctor came back, as if he was bringing some kind of salvation, right? For Bobby's condition, which was already very concerning, he came in and said, "Let's go, it's Guillain-Barré syndrome." His immune system is attacking his nerves. It's treatable. Oof, everyone was relieved, right? So, the doctors gave him the specific medication. The pain eased a bit, the vomiting stopped, and Bobby even felt well enough to go back home a few days later. The family breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed like the worst was finally over, but it wasn't. After a few days at home, the pain returned twice as strong. And then a new symptom appeared. Bobby's hair started to fall out, whole handfuls in his hands on the pillow there in the shower drain. Everything he did, he saw a clump of hair. The doctors were confused. Wow, but this has nothing to do with Guillain-Barré syndrome now. So they had to start from scratch, re-examine Bobby again, run tests from here and there. Nothing made sense. In his case, Bobby went into an almost delirious state of pain. He couldn't sleep well, couldn't eat well, couldn't do anything. And on September 7th, less than 2 weeks after his first discharge, he was back in the hospital. And this time, worse than ever, they transferred Bobby to the Hershey Medical Center. It was about 160 kilometers from where he was, a better equipped place. And there, a neurologist named Dr. Robert Brennan took over the case. Even from far away in the hallway, you could hear Bobby screaming in pain, cursing at the nurses, completely delirious from the pain. He would throw the medical equipment around the room and they had to physically restrain him to the bed. That Dr. Brennan was in the room every day, feeling completely powerless. Nothing he tried could relieve Bobby's pain. So, on September 22nd, 6 days after Bobby arrived, he fell into a coma. 3 days later, Dr. Brennan gathered the family in the room. His wife, stepdaughter, Angela, the little girl, so small, right? His siblings, Susan and David, and his mother, Mary, they were all there waiting. The doctor took a deep breath and said, "The new test results are in. We know what's happening." And then he explained, right? Thallium toxicity, a rare chemical substance, extremely poisonous, that destroys the body little by little and has been banned from common products in the United States for decades. It wasn't something you could find easily, okay? The family then looked at each other there. Initial reaction, what do you mean? What are we going to do? The doctor shook his head and said, unfortunately, there is no cure for this type of poisoning by thallium. 2 days later, on September 27th, the family gathered around the bed. The final decision was up to Bobby's wife. With no hope, she gave the signal to the team and the doctors turned off the life support. Bobby took his last breath and the autopsy later confirmed thallium levels 900 times above the lethal amount. Someone had put that somewhere, right? The question was who, how, and that's how the first clues appeared in the wrong place. The news of Bobby's death spread quickly in the Wilkes-Barre community. A young, strong, respected, hard-working electrician to just die out of nowhere like that. No one understood it. The autopsy brought the answer that no one wanted to hear. He had been poisoned, and it probably wasn't an accidental poisoning by thallium, a substance that's not easy to come by. Someone had done that to him. And since thallium was a controlled substance, rare, almost impossible to obtain without intent, the police treated it as a homicide. From the first day the doctor made that breakthrough, the detective on the case started with the obvious. The place where Bobby spent most of his time, the chemistry lab at Wilkes University, that was where he and his team did renovations, right? As we saw, they were working there, having lunch, eating, drinking. And those rooms were full of old chemicals, dirty benches, and debris. If there was thallium involved, it had to be from there, right? So on September 30th, 1991, the investigator on the case and his team entered that college building. The room was still a complete mess, equipment scattered around, wires hanging, dust all over the floor. They searched everything thoroughly and found 5 bottles of thallium in a storage room, all there intact, properly registered by the university. They tested the air, the surfaces, the pipes, everything came back negative for thallium residue. Nothing. But then what really caught their attention was on a relatively clean lab bench. There was a cloth carefully folded there, you know, like someone had folded it. There, next to that cloth, there was a handwritten note in really big letters. The detective picked it up and read, "Cloth for cleaning, Thalio. Touch me and die, detective." You can imagine, right? He felt a chill down his spine and said, "I'm in trouble." So he immediately sent that cloth for analysis. At the same time, he was scared out of his mind because he had touched a highly toxic poison there. He thought to himself, now I've solved the case, right? This is where he got poisoned. If there's this cloth here, maybe there are more around. But the results came back, and the results, my friends, were negative. No talio, the note was old, and they figured it had probably been left there for some time for a student, maybe as a prank between them or something like that. But there was something there that didn't really seem like a coincidence, right? I mean, Talio was the one who killed the guy who was working there. So they questioned the whole team, Sammy, Robert, the guys who worked with him there, and both of them had a history of those rough pranks. Not just gross stuff like spitting in the guy's soda, things like that. And to make things worse, they failed the polygraph test. Well, then the detective obviously asked, did you put something in his bottle as a prank? Both of them denied it. No way. They said the pranks were really dumb, but never to put someone's life at risk, right? Especially adding something when we didn't know what it was. It was just messing around, right? Spitting smoke from a good cigarette. But the detective still didn't believe them 100% at that moment. So Bob, guys, would bring a thermos from his house. Every day he drank iced tea, and his wife was the one who made that tea. So if someone wanted to poison him, maybe that thermos was the perfect place, right? But there was no concrete proof about that, and the university swore that no vial of thallium had gone missing from what they still stored there. In other words, a lot of loose ends, right? Then a result arrived that shifted the investigation's direction. Bob's wife and his 4-year-old stepdaughter, Angela, they also tested positive for traces of thallium, but just minimal traces, almost nothing. Not enough, at least, to cause serious harm, but enough to raise a question. It's not a lethal amount. So it only ended up in Bob's bloodstream, while the two of them who lived in the same house had exposure, but exposure without risk. The detective called Bob's siblings, Susan and David, and they talked there, right? The two of them didn't hide a specific suspicion. David said that when Bob got seriously ill, you guessed it, right? His wife barely moved to help. She called him asking for help. You remember that David came to the house, right? To carry his brother and all that? But he said that even though she called him, she didn't stay nearby watching what was happening or anything like that. She remained downstairs with her daughter during this, offering no help. So, what David was trying to say is that she didn't seem to be distressed enough given the deplorable situation that Bob was already going through at that moment. And Susan, Bob's other sister, said that at the hospital when they had to turn off, make the decision to turn off the machines because Bob was already there without. Probably with brain death and all, right? Susan said that the impression she had at that moment was much more of relief than of sadness. Kind of like when a weight is lifted off your shoulders, that's what Susan said. The detective listened to all of this carefully, started connecting the dots, but inside he was still reluctant because he thought, well, this doesn't prove anything, right? Everyone deals with grief in their own way, right? Maybe the woman just didn't want her daughter to see her stepfather in that state, suffering. Anyway, there was no proof of anything, right? A few days later, on October 25th, 1991, the detective sat face to face with Bob's wife. She was accompanied by a lawyer. He observed her every gesture, her posture. She was upright, direct gaze, firm, steady voice. Then he asked about the initial symptoms. She said that Bob had been feeling unwell for weeks, maybe even months, but nothing serious. She attributed it to work, as we saw, and said she never thought of poison. When the detective asked about the cut marks on her and her daughter, she gave a simple and strangely detailed explanation. Bob loved iced tea every morning. She would fill the thermos with the tea she made for him, keep it in the fridge, and the next day, take it to him. But when he came back home, sometimes he hadn't drunk it all, so he would pour a little cup for himself, right? So sometimes there was some left in his thermos, he'd close it, bring it home, and pour it back into the pitcher, so it just needed to be topped up. The next day, he'd pour it in and everything was fine. And his wife said in that interrogation that sometimes she and Angela would have a little bit, just a sip of that tea. And then she thought, oh, if he's being exposed, maybe that's how we had that minimal contact because we drank a little bit of tea at that moment. Then the detective exchanged some looks with the other detectives in the room. It was kind of weird, too specific, maybe too convenient, but not impossible, right? If Bob had been contaminated outside the house, traces could have come back in the bottle and, yes, contaminated the pitcher in minimal doses. So the detective asked for permission to search her apartment, the fridge, the pitcher, the thermos bottles, everything. She agreed right away, without hesitation. That afternoon then, the team arrived at the duplex where they lived. They searched every corner there, but there was no cut anywhere. Except on Bob's thermos bottle, traces on the lid's thread where he put his mouth to drink, and not on the bottle that was kept in the fridge. That pointed to direct ingestion, but it didn't explain how the poison got there. So the detective started to question if he had been too quick to rule out the lab. Maybe he needed to take a closer look again, but something didn't fit there. The poisoning seemed to have started much earlier than people thought. The case, guys, just so you know, was closed in 1992 with no concrete evidence of anything and no suspect, of course. It stayed in a drawer at the Justice Department until 1994, when a new technology emerged and changed the course of things. The timeline hidden in the strands of hair, the timeline... In August 1994, more than 2 years after the case was closed, the detective on the case went back to the house where Bob Curley lived. He knocked on the door and it was her, Bob's wife, who answered. Surprised, the detective got straight to the point. There had been an advancement in toxicology tests, a new technique that didn't exist back in '91. And this technique allowed them to analyze strands of hair as if they were a timeline, chemistry, you know? Each dose of poison left a permanent mark on the hair while it was growing, like rings marking each dose. And the detective, who would have the chance to look at this up close, needed to exhume Bob's body. The detective was apprehensive, right? Would the wife authorize it? What if she didn't authorize it? I don't know if there would be another legal way since the case was already closed. But he was counting on the wife's cooperation. She came, the wife didn't hesitate and said, let's do it. So if this technology emerges, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. So on August 23, 1994, an excavator opened the grave there in the Wilkes-Barre Cemetery. The coffin was removed, the police took the remains for analysis, and the hair strands that were still on the body were examined with millimetric precision. The result came in, and it hit like a punch, I would say. Bob hadn't been poisoned just once. There were several doses, repeated over almost an entire year. The first trace appeared in October and November, around 1990, just 6 to 8 weeks after the wedding in August of that year. In other words, something to pay close attention to, maybe. The doses continued, spaced out but constant, small amounts that accumulated slowly without any fuss. Until August 1991, when the symptoms exploded and even in the hospital a final massive dose was administered. That timeline in Bob's hair eliminated suspects one by one. His co-workers completely ruled out. The poisoning began much earlier, even before they started that university project. And it also lasted too long to be considered some stupid prank those guys pulled on him here. From what I understand, those two guys who were working with him there specifically were only on that team, not on others. His previous work then was completely sidelined. His brother David was also dismissed, and there aren't many details about that. But maybe the strongest point here is that he didn't have access to Thalio, who was being investigated. Also, they didn't find any connection linking him to it. And they also didn't see each other as often as the rings in the hair indicated. You know, so after all the people I mentioned here to you were analyzed one by one, there was one left, right? The wife had constant daily access since the beginning of the marriage. Coincidence, ring, brother, coincidence, it happens to him. There was a ring in his hair, poisoning. By the way, the wife prepared the tea for him. He took it every morning. So happy, like, oh, how she loves me now, but something here made me suspicious, right? Like this? I think she was lying then, right? In case she really drank the stuff. I think just being exposed there, the stuff must be so toxic that maybe just preparing it already put her at some minimal exposure. And by extension, so her daughter too by osmosis, right? Honestly, I don't know. I'm just making this up. There was more, okay? A few days before the first detected dose, Bob changed a life insurance policy, okay? He made his wife the main beneficiary now, and the amount was about $300,000. So, think about it. Adding to that more than $1 million I mentioned to you at the beginning of the episode, which came from a lawsuit that was going on from a company where Bob's wife's ex-husband worked, etc., etc. Right? Those are the elements there, the means, motives, and opportunities, they start to show up. The cut then came from an old bottle of rat poison that Bob's wife had kept in her house for a long time. This product, in fact, was manufactured well before it was banned in the United States. So on December 12, 1996, almost 5 years after Bob's death, his wife was arrested, charged with first-degree murder, but she ended up pleading guilty to third-degree murder. She was sentenced to 20 years with a minimum of 10 to be served, and she served the full 20 years. And it was only in 2016, going back to the introduction of the episode, that she re-emerged into society, walking through the prison gates. After 20 years with the cold wind blowing on her face. That same woman I described to you, who was leaving with no one waiting for her, no sign of remorse, nothing. The same one who, during 13 months of marriage, turned her husband's favorite iced tea into a slow and lethal weapon. The same one who watched the man suffer, scream, lose his hair, and fall into a coma. The same one who gave the final order to disconnect. The same one who, for money she didn't want to share, poisoned the man who loved her and dreamed of building a better life by her side. Bobby Curley died without ever suspecting the person next to him. That might be the darkest detail of this case. That's right, sometimes the poison comes from the person you trust the most. In this case, it came from Joan Curley, the wife. In a simple cup of tea that you drink every day, Bobby trusted and paid the highest price possible. In the introduction, I joked, you'll look and think, wow, I went back in time. That's right, the poison ladies, right? It's really crazy, right, guys, how we look at the way the crime happened, isn't it? When we see cases like this that involve, for example, a man who kills his wife, it's always something more visceral, violent, right? Knife, gun, and so on. So strangulation is usually the case, suffocation, right? And then you see women, at least historically, right, in criminology documents, we see that these kinds of deaths, like poisoning and so on, are more common. And many times it goes unnoticed, right? If there's not a guy there, an investigator who's really digging deep to try to understand what really happened, it just stays like that, right? In Bobby's case, it was noticed, but the sentence was rather lenient. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment. Thank you so much for your company. A kiss from the redhead, and see you in the next episode.